I returned from a 10-day business trip and found strangers living in my house. My neighbor told me, "Your wife sold the house 3 days ago. She took all the money and left with another man." In that moment, my whole body went cold. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name's Salvador Ivanez Carmona. I'm 52 years old. I'm a civil engineer by training, and I've been working for over 25 years on infrastructure projects for public administrations and construction sector companies in Aragon. I've built bridges, supervised highways, signed technical reports on structures that are still standing today and will be when I'm gone. That's what I know how to do. That's what I've done since I was 27, when I got my first serious contract and understood that life is built just like a construction project, foundation by foundation, without skipping any phases, without trusting that the materials will hold up more than they're capable of. I was born in Teruel in 1971 in a small house where money was just enough and where my father, a lathe operator by profession, taught me that a man is worth what he does, not what he promises. I remember the winters in that house with a heater that worked intermittently and a radio in the kitchen that always had something to say. When I was 16, the first color television arrived in the living room, and that was an event the whole family remembered for months. Years later, when I started working at my first engineering firm, they put me in front of a computer that took up half a desk and told me to learn how to use it. Nobody really knew how it worked, neither them nor me. We all learned it together, stumbling along. Like we learned almost everything that was worthwhile in that era. I met Immaculata Rios Valverde in 1994 at the wedding of a cousin of hers whom I barely knew, but who was a friend of a coworker. She was 22 and I was 23. There was something in her way of speaking, direct and without unnecessary embellishments, that seemed completely different to me from anything I'd known before. We got married 2 years later, in October 1996, in a small church in Zaragoza with no more than 80 guests and a reception that we paid for between the two of us with the little we had saved. There was no long honeymoon. There was a week in Lisbon, and the following Monday, we were back at work with the new wedding ring on my finger and the accounts already clear for the next month. We'd been together for 27 years when everything I'm about to tell you happened. 27 years, 4 months, and 18 days to be exact. I'm an engineer. I never forget numbers. During those years, I lived off of and for construction projects. I traveled more than I should have. There were birthdays I arrived late to, dinners I missed, weekends that work took before I could defend them. I'm not going to pretend I was the perfect husband, because I wasn't. I worked excessively. I assumed that economic stability was proof enough of love, and in that I was wrong for longer than I like to admit. I'm saying it here at the beginning, before anyone can reproach me for it, because I'd rather be the first to say it myself. What I can say, and I say it with the same calm with which I sign a technical report, is that I never lied, never hid money, never built a parallel life behind anyone's back. In the end, that's also a way to measure a man. We bought the house in 1998 when we'd been married for 2 years and our son Adrian was barely one, a 110 square meters apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Zaragoza, with a square in front and a park 3 blocks away. It cost what things cost back then, effort, a 20-year mortgage, and several Sundays going around banks with folders under our arms. The contract was registered in both our names. That's how we wanted it. That's how we signed it before a notary. At that moment, I thought that meant something solid. I thought a shared signature was a promise neither of us would break. Adrian, our son, was 26 at the time and had been living in an apartment in the center of Zaragoza for just over a year. I helped him with the rent, 720 euros a month, because he was just starting to get established and because that's the kind of thing a father does without a second thought. I mention it now in passing because later it's going to matter more than it seems. The week before I left on my trip, Immaculata was quieter than usual. I noticed, but I let it go. One morning, I found her at the bedroom desk reviewing papers, and when I came in, she closed it too quickly with that gesture of someone hiding something before it's seen. She had a pen in her hand, and on the table a brown cardboard folder I'd never seen. I asked her what she was reviewing. She told me, without looking up, that they were home insurance bills. There was no reason to doubt. I didn't doubt. That was Tuesday, February 13th, 2024. I left on my trip on Wednesday morning with just enough luggage for 10 days, the computer, my briefcase, and the house key in the right pocket of my coat where I always keep it. It's a gesture I don't remember learning. Before leaving anywhere, I take out the key, look at it for a second, and put it away. I've always done it, like someone checking that the blueprints are folded correctly before entering a meeting. A small, unimportant habit, or so I thought. I returned on Saturday, February 24th. It was 6:40 in the evening. The train arrived 15 minutes late at Zaragoza Delicious, and I took a taxi from the station. The taxi driver turned on the radio. Something I didn't recognize was playing. I looked out the window at the familiar buildings on the way home and felt that quiet calm you feel when you return to a place you know by heart. I got out of the taxi, took my suitcase, approached the building entrance, made the same gesture as always, took the key out of my pocket, looked at it for a moment, held it in my palm while with the other, I rang the apartment's doorbell. The doorbell rang on the other side. Silence. I pressed it again. Silence again. I told myself that maybe Immaculata had gone out to run an errand. I looked up at the living room window and saw a silhouette that wasn't hers. Then I saw a little girl, no more than 5 years old, looking at me from behind the glass with wide eyes and her hand resting on the pane. I was speechless. It was then that I heard Eugenio Polares Montoya's door opening slowly. Eugenio, 68 years old, a neighbor from the second floor since before we arrived in the building. A man of few words, the kind who says what needs to be said and adds nothing more. He came out to the landing with his hands in his pockets. He looked at me in a way I'd never seen before. He lowered his voice as if the walls could hear. "Salvador," he said, "I've been waiting for you to show up for 3 days." I was still holding the key, the same old key, the one I had taken out of my pocket thousands of times in 27 years, the one that afternoon no longer opened anything. I didn't know it yet, but that key was going to appear again at the end of all this, only in a completely different way. Eugenio didn't move from his doorway. He had his hands inside his trouser pockets, and his shoulders were slightly slumped, like someone who has been carrying something for days that doesn't belong to them, but that they can't put down either. On Monday morning, he said, the movers came, a big company truck, 2 men who didn't say anything, just worked. She was going up and down with boxes. It took them about 4 hours to empty everything. I still didn't speak. I had my suitcase beside me and the key still in my palm, although I no longer really knew what to do with it. She left with a man, one I'd never seen before, a blonde guy in his late 40s with a big, dark car. She put 2 bags in the trunk and got into the passenger seat. She didn't look up, didn't say goodbye to anyone. He paused briefly. Then he added with his way of saying important things as if they were simple. The next day, Tuesday, these people showed up, a young family with a little girl, already with their own keys. I sat on the entrance step. It wasn't a decision. My legs simply stopped performing their function with the same conviction as before. Eugenio stood next to me without adding anything else, which is exactly what should be done when there's nothing useful left to say. The February cold seeped down the collar of my coat. In an apartment upstairs, someone had the television on. I put the key in my right pocket. The same old gesture, automatic without thinking, even though there was no longer any door behind it. That night, I slept in a room at a hotel on Calle Alfonso that I knew from other work trips. I went up to the room, sat on the bed without unpacking my suitcase, and stared at the wall for a time I didn't try to measure. I didn't cry yet. No, there are blows the body needs to process before turning them into something recognizable. And sitting on that bed, with my coat still on and my shoes on, I began to remember, not in an orderly fashion, but as memories come when you don't summon them, in fragments, in fleeting images, in the smell of a specific moment that suddenly returns without warning. Immaculata and I have been married for 27 years. That's a long time to summarize in a single sentence. It's enough time for 2 people to become part of each other's landscape. Always there, always recognizable, so familiar that you stop looking at them with real attention. I met her in October 1994 at a wedding I attended with a coworker. She was 22 and was sitting 3 chairs to my left during dinner. When someone made an overly long toast, she glanced at me with an expression that said exactly what I was thinking. That was it. We got married 2 years later in a small church in Zaragoza with 80 guests and a week in Lisbon as the only concession to romanticism. The following Monday, back to work. What we built from there was a life without ostentation or want, with its good seasons and its difficult stages, as all real ones have. We bought the house on Calle Predicadores in March 1998, 110 square meters, 4th floor, a small terrace we used in the summer and forgot in the winter. The mortgage lasted 20 years. We made the last payment in February 2018, and that night, we opened a bottle of wine that wasn't particularly good, but that we valued as if it were. The contract was registered in both our names, Salvador Ivanez Carmona and Immaculata Rios Valverde, because that's what we decided without hesitation. A shared signature that at the time I understood as something permanent. Adrian was born in August 1997. 13 months after the wedding, he grew up in that apartment, in that neighborhood. He studied business administration, finished with sufficient grades, and the previous year he moved out, as children do when they reach a certain age. He rented an apartment downtown, a second-floor unit with little light, but well located, and I helped him with 720 euros a month while he consolidated his income. It was what a father with the means does without giving it much thought. I didn't give it much thought. That was also going to change. I worked excessively during those 27 years. Projects in Huesca, in Teruel, in Legrano. Weeks away, canceled dinners. An 11th birthday for Adrian that I arrived at after they had already cleared away the cake. I still remember it. There are small guilts that weigh disproportionately to the size they had when they occurred. I'm not saying this to seek understanding. I'm saying it because it's true, and I prefer to be the first to acknowledge it. But in the last few months of the previous year, something at home had changed in texture, and I didn't know how to name it in time. Immaculata was a woman of fixed routines. Same time to get up, coffee always before 8, a call to her mother on Wednesdays at noon. A quiet predictability that was part of the natural order of things. That's why I noticed, without stopping to analyze, that this routine had begun to show cracks. The calls to her mother started being made from another room with the door ajar. There were 2 consecutive weekends when she traveled to Pamplona to see her sister, something unusual. One afternoon, I found a bottle of perfume in the bathroom that I hadn't seen before, discreet, with no visible brand. And when I asked, she said a friend from the gym had given it to her. I didn't ask any further. It was a bottle. It was a visit. It was an ajar door. That's what trust does when it goes too long without being examined. It makes what's right in front of you invisible. What I didn't know that night, sitting on that hotel bed with a useless key in my pocket, was that each of those small anomalies was part of something calculated, with a precision that I, as an engineer, would have admired in another context. And I also didn't know that the next day, when I began to understand the real magnitude of what had happened, I was going to discover that the betrayal had an exact value in euros, a specific start date, and a name I had never heard spoken inside my own house. The next morning, I called Lorena Exposito de Vila's office. A co-worker had given me her name 3 years earlier, when he had a problem with a disputed inheritance among his siblings. She's meticulous and doesn't get intimidated. He told me. At that moment, I wrote down the number in my address book without imagining that one day I would need it for something that directly affected me. It was Sunday, February 25th. Lorena didn't work on Sundays, but she had a voicemail activated. I left her a brief explanation with the essential details and added that the matter was urgent. She called back at 10:15 in the morning. Her voice was that of someone who listens before speaking, who processes before opining. She asked me to repeat calmly what had happened. I did. When I finished, there were 2 seconds of silence on the other end. I need you to come tomorrow first thing with all the documentation you have for the property. Deed, records, canceled mortgage, everything in your ID. I'm going to make some inquiries this afternoon. That was all. No drama. No words of comfort I hadn't asked for. I like that about her. On Monday morning, I showed up at her office on Paseo de la Independencia with a folder I had rescued from my work briefcase, where I keep copies of important documents out of professional habit. It's something I learned in my early years of engineering. Originals get lost. Copies save projects. That morning, I understood that this habit could also save other things. Lorena Exposito de Vila was 44 years old, with her hair tied back and a desk that spoke well of her, organized with labeled files stacked with a visible logic. She had me sit down, open her computer, and began to consult the property registry. While I explained everything Eugenio had told me 2 nights before, what she found in the records froze my blood in a way I hadn't expected, not because it was inexplicable, but because it was perfectly explicable, and that was worse. The property on Calle Predicadores had been sold on Wednesday, February 21st, 2024, while I was 400 kilometers away in a construction meeting. The deeded price was €340,000. The buyer was a young couple from Legrano who acted in good faith, without knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the transaction. For the operation to be possible, someone had presented before a notary a power of attorney in the name of Salvador Ibanez Carmona, authorizing Immaculata Rios Valverde to act on behalf of both owners. Without that power of attorney, the sale of a property registered in the names of 2 people cannot be formalized with the signature of only one. It's a basic legal mechanism, elementary, that any lawyer knows. The problem was that I had never signed that power of attorney, never been before any notary to grant anything, never given my authorization for any real estate operation of any kind. Lorena stopped typing and looked at me. The signature that appears on the power of attorney isn't yours. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer, and the notary who authorized it, she continued, turning the monitor towards me so I could see the name. He's called Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros. He has an office in Zaragoza, on Calle San Vicente de Paul. He's been practicing for 17 years. I wrote the name in the margin of the folder. Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros, a notary with a 17-year career who had stamped his seal on a power of attorney with a falsified identity. Either he hadn't verified what he was obligated to verify, or he had deliberately looked the other way. In either case, his participation in what happened was not accidental. Lorena opened another window on her computer. The €340,000 was transferred in full to a current account that's not in your name or hers. It's in the name of a limited company established 8 months ago. The legal representative of that company is a man named Sebastián Mora Trigueros. I heard that name for the first time in that office on a Monday morning in late February with the gray winter light coming through the window and the distant sound of traffic in the background. Sebastián Mora Trigueros, 45 years old, an entrepreneur in the real estate sector, a name that until that moment meant absolutely nothing to me. It turned out it meant everything. Lorena explained to me with the same technical calm with which I would explain the loads of beam supports. Sebastián Mora had been operating in the Aragonese real estate market for over a decade. Sales, intermediations, some residential development, nothing flashy. The type of profile that appears in many files without standing out in any of them. The company to whose account the €340,000 had gone was 8 months old. It had been established in June of the previous year in apparent normality, with nothing in the commercial registry to make it seem different from the thousands of companies that open and close every year in Spain. 8 months, June of the previous year. Immaculata had gone out that summer for 2 consecutive weekends to Pamplona, she told me, to see her sister. I remained silent, looking at the papers on Lorena's desk. I'm an engineer. I've spent decades working with blueprints, with phases, with execution schedules. I know perfectly well what it means for something to have been planned for months before it's executed. I know the difference between a mistake and a decision. I know what a process looks like when someone has thought it through with time and care. What I had in front of me was not an impulse. It was a project, with its design phase, its preparation phase, and its delivery date, calculated for when I would be at a sufficient distance not to interfere. Lorena closed her computer and crossed her hands on the desk. This doesn't end here, Salvador. There's clear fraudulent intent, there's forgery of a public document, and there's the participation of a public official whose actions we're going to examine with a magnifying glass. What I need from you now is that you don't do anything on your own, nothing. No contact with her, no calls to him, no visits to that notary. Everything that moves from now on goes through me. I nodded, not out of unthinking obedience, but because I understood, with the same clarity I understand a structure that needs reinforcement, that acting before having all the data would compromise what we were building. I left the office with the morning cold on my face and the folder under my arm. In the right pocket of my coat, the key was still there. That small, familiar weight that for 27 years had meant home, stability, a specific place in the world. That afternoon, back at the hotel, I opened the folder on the bed and began to organize the documents with the same methodology I used to organize a construction file. Date, concept, amount, origin, column by column. What I had was only the first layer of what had happened, and it was already devastating. But something in the way Lorena had said, "This doesn't end here," told me that there were others beneath that layer, and that when the time came to lift them, what I would find was going to retroactively change the meaning of things I thought I had understood a long time ago. I didn't yet know that that same week, upon reviewing the statements of an account I barely monitored, I would find something that would make the 340,000 euros seem like just the beginning. The bank statements arrived by email on Tuesday night. Lorena had asked for access to all accounts linked to our marriage. The main current account, a savings account we opened together in 2003 for extraordinary expenses, and a deposit book that Immaculata managed for household expenses. It took me a little less than an hour to gather the access details. I hadn't reviewed two of those accounts with real attention for years. There were funds that worked on their own, discreet, with no apparent surprises. The savings account was the one Lorena wanted to examine first. When I opened the statement from the previous year, it took me several seconds to understand what I was seeing. Not because the numbers were hard to read, but because the mind needs a moment to accept that something that seemed stable had been quietly emptied for some time. During the 18 months prior to February 2024, the account had recorded 137 withdrawals, all for amounts ranging between 400 euros and 600 euros, none high enough to trigger an automatic notification, none infrequent enough to be conspicuous. A perfectly calculated cadence to go unnoticed by any eye not specifically looking for that pattern. The accumulated total was 83,400 euro. I stared at that figure for a time I couldn't measure. The mouse cursor blinked on the screen. Somewhere in the hotel corridor, someone dragged a wheeled suitcase across the floor, and that small, mundane noise seemed completely alien to what was happening in that room. 83,400 euros withdrawn in silence, in invisible portions over a year and a half. Added to the 340,000 euros from the apartment sale, the total amount exceeded 423,000 euro. I called Lorena at 11:15 at night. She answered on the second ring. I gave her the figures without preamble, just as data is transmitted in a technical meeting when there's no room for beating around the bush. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said only, "Tomorrow at 9, bring the printed statements for the last 24 months. I hung up. I lay back with the light on and the white ceiling above me. And then, without having sought it, without having summoned it, the memory came. It was from 2009, a time I prefer not to relive in too much detail, because it was the hardest period of my professional life. The company where I had been working for 8 years entered a restructuring process, which in corporate language sounds orderly and reasonable. And in real life means there's a list of names, and yours might be on it. Mine almost was. 3 months of uncertainty, closed-door meetings, colleagues disappearing from the organizational chart like erased boxes from a blueprint without a trace. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I'd come home with my jaw clenched and little to offer. There were nights when I sat in the living room after Adrian had gone to bed and just sat there quietly without turning anything on. Immaculata didn't ask me what was wrong. There was no need. She would sit next to me with a cup of coffee and stay silent, not filling the air with words that were useless. She didn't demand explanations, didn't turn my silence into a conflict that had to be managed, didn't ask me to put a name to what I was feeling. Some nights we'd stay like that for a long hour, 2 people on a sofa in silence, needing nothing more. When they confirmed my position wasn't on the list of affected staff, I only told her a few words over dinner. She nodded and continued eating. That reaction, so devoid of exaggerated relief, so without fuss, was what touched me the most. That happened 15 years ago, and as I lay on that hotel bed with the statements in hand, that memory settled in with an uncomfortable comfort, as things do that you can't simply push aside. I'm not telling this to mitigate what I'm about to narrate. There's no possible mitigating factor for what she did. I'm telling it because it would be dishonest to omit it, and because the woman who sat silently by my side in 2009 and the woman who emptied our account over 18 months exist in the same body. Reconciling that is something I still carry and probably will for a long time. The next morning, with the printed statements on Lorena's table, I did what engineers do when a project has failed. I reviewed backward. I identified at what stage the deviation began. I traced the origin with the same methodology I use to audit a construction project. Chronological, without skipping stages, without leaving gaps where there should be data. First quarter of 2023. Immaculata started going out on Saturdays with greater frequency than usual, always with plausible reasons. The market, the gym, a friend who needed company, nothing that in itself indicated anything. June 2023, the 2 weekends in Pamplona. Her sister Consuelo had been living there for years. It wasn't impossible. It wasn't implausible. October 2023. Coming home from work earlier than expected, I found her at the bedroom desk with papers she quickly gathered up upon hearing me arrive. I asked her what she was reviewing. She replied that they were home insurance bills. November 2023. The phone calls started being made from rooms with the door closed. One afternoon, passing through the hallway, I heard only the end of a sentence before she suddenly lowered her voice. When he's not here, I didn't ask who she was referring to or in what context she was saying it. February 2024, the week before my trip, the brown cardboard folder on the desk, she picked it up before I could see it. Well, I asked what it was. She told me home insurance bills. The same answer in October and in February, identical. Word for word. I brought this detail to Lorena with the feeling of someone who has located a crack in a seemingly intact beam. She noted it without comment and continued reviewing the documents. The withdrawals began in August 2022, she said without looking up from the papers. 18 months of active preparation before the sale. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to any trigger. It was a decision made much earlier. August 2022, I mentally went back. That summer we had had our most tense argument in years, a project that extended 3 weeks longer than planned and forced me to cancel a few days of vacation we had agreed upon. She said with a calmness that I then interpreted as composure and now understood differently, that she was tired of projects always coming first. I replied that it was temporary, that the assignment would end soon, that everything would return to normal. 2 weeks after that conversation, the withdrawals began. I don't draw conclusions without sufficient evidence, but that correlation, placed on the table as if it were the final piece of a calculation that had long been unresolved, needed no further verification. The plan had a start date, and that summer argument, in which I thought I had simply failed as a husband, had probably been the moment she made the final decision. That was the second layer. And Lorena, as she gathered the papers at the end of that meeting, looked at me with an expression that told me, without needing words, that there was still more underneath. Adrian lived a 12-minute drive from the hotel where I had settled. 12 minutes that I drove on Wednesday afternoon with the engine running and the radio off, thinking about the most precise way to do what I had to do. I hadn't told him I was coming. That was deliberate. His voice came through the intercom, slightly sleepy, like someone who has spent the afternoon at home with no fixed purpose. When he heard my name, he opened the door without saying anything else. I went up the 2 flights of stairs. He was waiting for me at the apartment threshold in a gray t-shirt with his arms crossed, in that gesture that sons inherit without knowing from where when they feel observed. The apartment was small, but functional. A living room with a work table in a corner, an integrated kitchen, shelves with books in irregular order. The blinds were halfway down. On the table was a glass with cold coffee and a screen on with something he interrupted when I entered. I sat on the sofa without waiting for an invitation. He sat in the chair in front of the table with his back to the screen and looked at me with that contained expression I recognized, because it's the same one he puts on when he knows a conversation he'd rather not have is approaching. Do you know why I'm here? I asked. A brief silence. Then I imagined so. Just that, without adding anything, without asking how I was, without asking where I'd stayed the night, without any of the things a son says when he's truly surprised by the situation. I imagined so. Those 4 words confirmed what I already suspected since Eugenio had described the scene on Monday with the truck and the boxes and the blonde man by the big car. Adrian wasn't surprised. Adrian was waiting. How long have you known about your mother and that man? I said. He took a while to answer, not because he was searching for the answer, but because he was measuring how much of it he wanted to give me. About 8 months, he finally said. 8 months since June of the previous year, approximately, since Sebastián Mora Trigueros' company was already established and the plan was moving forward in silence. And you didn't say anything. It wasn't a question, it was the allowed statement of something that needed no further confirmation. Adrian uncrossed his arms and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor for a moment before answering. It wasn't my place to get involved. It's your business as a couple. I didn't want to be in the middle. He said it with the conviction of someone who has rehearsed that justification several times in his head and has come to believe it's reasonable. There was no malice in his tone, nor was there guilt, just the slightly worn comfort of someone who chose the easiest position and has been living with that choice for months without questioning it too much. I want to be exact about what I felt at that moment, because it's important. It wasn't anger. Anger needs energy, and I had been running on a reserve for days that was depleting faster than I could replenish it. It was something colder, more permanent. It was the understanding that my son, 26 years old, whom I had helped get settled, whose rent I contributed to every month without conditions, had known for 8 months that something serious was brewing in my life and had made the active decision to say nothing to me. Not about the sale, not about the fraud. He didn't know that. What he knew was that his mother was in a relationship with another man and that his father was still living without knowing it, and that had seemed to him a matter to stay out of. That thing you call not getting involved, I said with a calm that was hard to maintain. While your mother was building something for months that directly affected me, that has another name, Adrian. It's called choosing. He raised his eyes to me. I didn't know anything about the house, Dad. I swear I didn't. I know. There was a long silence. The kind of silence that isn't filled because there's nothing that should fill it. If that changes anything, he added with a caution that betrayed he already suspected the answer. It changes what you knew and what you did with it. It doesn't change that you made a decision. I stood up. He made a gesture as if to get up too, as if the conversation were to continue or be resolved with something more. But there was nothing more. I had said what I came to say. The apartment. I said before reaching the door. The rent. Starting next month, you take care of it. I didn't say it harshly. I didn't raise my voice. There was no hint of punishment or revenge in my tone, because it wasn't that. It was simply the natural consequence of having discovered that the unconditional help I was giving had coexisted for 8 months with a silence that cost me more than any number can express. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He looked at me from the sofa with an expression that mixed surprise with something like belated understanding. Is that all you're going to say to me? He asked. Yes. I went out to the landing. I heard the door close softly behind me without any slam. I went down the 2 flights of stairs and out onto the street with the late February cold clinging to my clothes. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel I had done justice. I only felt the specific weight of that kind of loss that has no name on legal forms or in accounting books. The disappointment a son leaves when you choose to look at him differently for the first time and see him as he is, not as you have been building him in your head for years. There are things that once seen don't allow a return to the previous position, not because you don't want to, but because the gaze, once adjusted, can no longer travel the same path as before. What happened with Adrian that afternoon was kept in a separate compartment from the rest of what I was managing, not because it was less important, but because mixing it with the legal process would have been a methodological error. Engineers learn early that each problem has its own solution structure, and that trying to solve them all with the same tool is the surest way not to solve any of them correctly. That night, back at the hotel, Lorena sent me a brief message. She had located information about Sebastián Mora that changed the dimension of what we were investigating. It wasn't about the sale of the apartment. It was about something that had happened 2 years earlier in another city with another person. She asked me to stop by her office the next morning. I put the phone on the nightstand. The third layer was about to open up, and something in the tone of Lorena's message told me that what I would find underneath was going to be worse than what either of us had anticipated up to that point. Lorena's office smelled of freshly brewed coffee when I arrived the next day. It was 9:05 in the morning. She was already seated with several pages spread out on her desk and a pen in her hand, marking lines with the concentration of someone who has been working since before I woke up. She made no introduction. Sebastián Mora Trigueros, she said, pushing a sheet towards me. Valencia 2022. The document was an extract from a closed court proceeding. I read it slowly, with the same attention I read a technical report when I know that somewhere in a paragraph there's a piece of data that will change the diagnosis of the whole. 2 years earlier in Valencia, a woman named Rosario Pinilbur Alcantara, 51 years old, had reported Sebastián Mora for a scheme practically identical to the one I had just discovered. Her husband had been away for months for work reasons. Sebastián had gradually entered her life, gained her trust, and articulated an operation to sell a jointly owned property using manipulated documentation. The report came too late. The money had already left the country to an account in Portugal, and the chain of transfers was complex enough that the judicial investigation failed to freeze it in time. The proceeding was closed for insufficient evidence 17 months after it was opened. Rosario Pinilbur lost 190,000 euros. She recovered nothing. I looked at it for a few seconds without saying anything. Then I looked up at Lorena. It wasn't his first mistake, I said. No, it was his first rehearsal, from which he learned not to make the mistakes he made there. She picked up the sheet calmly. In Valencia, he lacked precision in the documentary chain and acted too hastily. What he set up with you is more sophisticated. The company established in advance. The progressive withdrawals to avoid generating alerts. The choice of notary. There's an 8-month gap between the end of the Valencia process and the incorporation of the company that received the money from your house. 8 months. The exact time he needed to analyze what had gone wrong, correct it, and start over with another target. And the notary? I asked. Fuentes Ballesteros. Lorena opened another folder. Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros has been practicing for 17 years, as we already know. We've reviewed the notarial deeds he has authorized in the last 4 years with the help of a contact at the Notarial College. There are 3 real estate operations in which Sebastián Mora's name appears as an intermediary or party representative. In 2 of them, the other selling party was a person different from the registered owner of the property. She paused briefly. Fuentes isn't just someone who looked the other way once, he's part of the mechanism. I leaned back in my chair. As an engineer, I've reviewed structures that seemed solid until you found the first crack and, by pulling on that thread, discovered that the crack was actually a network of fissures distributed throughout the entire system. What Lorena was showing me was exactly that, not an impulsive act between 2 people who got carried away. It was a structure designed, tested, corrected, and executed by someone who had spent years perfecting the method. Then, Lorena placed the last sheet on the table. She did it with a deliberation that told me she had consciously saved it for the end. This is what changes everything before. It was a 4-page report prepared by Gerardo Villanueva Sepulveda, the private investigator Lorena had hired days earlier. Gerardo was 51, a former official in the asset analysis area of a tax agency delegation who had moved to the private sector after an early retirement. Lorena had described him the first time as someone who knows where to look when others don't, and the report in my hands justified it. Gerardo had tracked Sebastián Mora's movements over the previous 36 months, not just the financial ones. Also his travel, the real estate operations in which he had participated as an agent or intermediary, and the public records associated with his business activity. The result revealed something I hadn't considered as a possibility. Sebastián Mora had conducted a valuation inquiry on the property on Calle Predicadores in March 2023, 9 months before the sale. The inquiry was of a technical nature, the kind that professionals in the sector do to estimate the market value of a property. It wasn't illegal, it didn't require the owner's authorization, it was public, discreet, and completely invisible to me. What it meant was that Sebastian knew the exact value of my house 9 months before the operation was executed, and that this inquiry had occurred 3 months before the withdrawals from the savings account began in August 2022. He hadn't entered Immaculata's life and then casually discovered there was an asset he could monetize. He had identified the asset first, had the property appraised, and then had built everything else around that data. I reread that line twice to make sure I understood what it said correctly. Sebastian Mora knew what my house was worth before Immaculata knew who Sebastian Mora was. I felt something that wasn't exactly rage, but its coldest version, the understanding that what I had lived as a life, he had seen from the beginning as an operation. That while I was traveling and signing contracts and building structures that took years to complete, someone had been calculating the liquidable value of what I had built at home. Lorena waited for me to finish reading before continuing. "This doesn't eliminate Immaculata's responsibility," she said. "She made her own decisions, but it does precisely define the origin of the scheme, and that's relevant to the process because it determines the degree of premeditation and the number of imputable persons." I nodded. My gaze was fixed on the report, but I was no longer reading it. I was doing what I do when a project enters a critical phase. Organizing the available information, assigning priorities, defining the next steps in the correct order. The total amount was €423,400. It had a name, a date, a mechanism, and a documented origin. I had a notary with a pattern of irregular conduct. I had an operator with a history in another province and a methodology refined between one case and the next. What I needed now was a plan as well-structured as theirs, and that, unlike everything they had done, was going to be done within the law, with every step recorded, verified, and signed. Gerardo Villanueva knew where Immaculata and Sebastian were. Lorena had confirmed it in the message the night before without giving details. The details came at the end of that meeting when she closed the folder and said with the same usual technical neutrality, "We've located them, and they don't yet know we've started." There's a phase in any engineering project that young technicians often underestimate. It's not the design phase, which has its own complexity, nor the execution phase, which demands presence and constant decision-making. It's the planning phase, the one that happens before a single machine is moved, before a single contract with a supplier is signed, before anything is communicated to anyone. The phase where you sit down with the blueprints in front of you and decide exactly in what order everything will happen and why that order and not any other. That week I became the project manager of my own recovery. The first decision was the most important and also the most difficult. To maintain an appearance of absolute normality, to keep answering work emails, to keep attending meetings, to keep being Salvador Ibanez Carmona, civil engineer with 25 years of experience, without anyone in his professional circle noticing that inside, I was managing the most serious crisis of my adult life. Not because I cared about my image, but because any unusual behavior could reach the wrong ears. And in this phase, invisibility was the most valuable advantage I had. The second was to establish a strict communication protocol with Lorena. Nothing through ordinary channels that could be later consulted by third parties. The face-to-face meetings in her office with the physical documents reviewed there and kept under her custody. The calls only when strictly necessary and from a secondary prepaid phone that I bought at a service station on the Legrano Highway, paying in cash. It may seem excessive. An engineer would say it's simply risk management. The third was to structure the file as I structure any construction project. Clearly defined phases, a responsible party assigned to each action, an estimated execution time, and a verification criterion before moving to the next stage. Lorena was in charge of the legal front, Gerardo of the information front. I was in charge of collecting and organizing all the available technical and financial documentation, which in my case, due to decades of professional habit, was considerably more complete than what Immaculata probably calculated. I had copies of deeds, statements from previous years, mortgage payment records, correspondence with the bank, photographs of the apartment's interior taken during a renovation in 2016. Each document was a piece. Each piece had its place in the overall plan. On the Tuesday of that same week, while reviewing the notarial college records related to Fuentes Ballesteros with Lorena, the phone I had on the table vibrated. The screen showed a name I hadn't seen since the Saturday Eugenio told me what had happened. Inmaculada Lorena Sowit. She looked at me without saying anything. I looked at the phone for 2 full vibrations before picking it up. Yes, I answered. Her voice sounded exactly, as always, calm, without particular inflections, the same register of someone calling to ask something mundane. I wanted to know if you had returned well from your trip. I felt something tighten in my chest. I didn't let it show on my face. Yes, fine. I'm at the office sorting out some work papers. I have a meeting now. I can't talk. A brief pause on the other end. Oh, of course, nothing important. We'll talk another day. Sure. I hung up. I placed the phone face down on the table. I stared at the documents for exactly 30 seconds without seeing anything on them. Then I turned it over, moved it to the side, and continued reading for where I had left off. Lorena didn't ask anything for several minutes. When she finally spoke, it was about the case file. That was the right thing to do. What I don't tell easily because it requires a type of honesty that costs more than the technical kind, is what happened that same afternoon. After leaving the office, I went down to the street and walked 3 blocks without a specific direction. I stopped at the entrance of a building I didn't know. I leaned my back against the wall and stood for a moment with my eyes closed and my jaw clenched, trying to keep something that was rising from my chest from getting any higher. I barely contained it. 27 years get compressed in a particular way when you hear for the first time the voice of the person who lived them with you after knowing everything you know. There's no sufficient preparation for that. You can have the blueprints perfectly drawn and the file impeccably organized. And still, there's something that no methodology can fully anticipate. I breathed. I kept walking. That night, I ate alone in a bar near the hotel and didn't have dessert. The following week, Gerardo Villanueva delivered the location report. Immaculada and Sebastian had settled in a rented apartment in Murcia in a residential building in the La Flota neighborhood. The lease agreement was in Sebastian's name. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and a garage space. They had been there since Wednesday, February 20th, 2 days before I returned from my trip. They had chosen Murcia with some logic, far enough from Zaragoza to reduce the probability of a chance encounter, large enough as a city to go unnoticed, and with direct connections to Portugal, which, given the precedent of the Valencia case where the money had left the country that way, was not an unimportant detail. Gerardo also confirmed that Sebastian was still operating. He had registered 2 real estate valuation inquiries in Murcia in the 15 days since his arrival. The man wasn't hiding. He was working, confident, methodical, completely unaware that someone had been undoing layer by layer everything he had built for 10 days. That was exactly what we needed. On the Thursday of that week, Lorena formally requested the intervention of a handwriting expert for the analysis of the signature that appeared on the notarial power of attorney. The appointed expert was Augusto Valcarcel Herrero, 56 years old, with 22 years of experience in forensic document examination and accredited appearances in more than 40 judicial proceedings. Lorena knew him from a previous case and trusted his precision. Augusto received the original document and the authentic signature specimens I provided from 3 employment contracts and a notarial deed from 2015. He would need 10 days to issue the full report. Those were 10 days we could use to continue building the rest of the file. It was during that same week that the moment occurred that came closest to compromising everything we had advanced. On Friday afternoon, I received a visit at work from a department colleague, Marcelo Ortiz, who stopped by my desk to discuss a matter of an ongoing tender. Marcelo was an affable and observant man, with a habit of noticing details that others overlook. While we were talking about the tender file, his eyes fell for a moment on the secondary phone that I had left on the desk when I took it out of my pocket upon sitting down. 2 phones, he said with the lightness of someone making an observation without further intention. I paused for a second. I couldn't afford the company one and my personal one. I replied, putting the secondary one back in my pocket with a neutral gesture. Since they changed my company contract, I prefer to keep them separate. Marcelo nodded with the same naturalness with which he had asked, and continued with what he had come to discuss. I left that conversation with my pulse slightly elevated, not because of Marcelo, who hadn't seen anything relevant, but because it reminded me that invisibility requires constant attention and that a single slip-up at the wrong moment could collapse weeks of careful work. That night at the hotel, I reviewed the entire file schedule. Each phase, each responsible person, each estimated date, everything was still in order. Augusto would deliver the expert report in 10 days. Gerardo continued the surveillance in Murcia. Lorena was preparing the documentation for the formal complaint to the investigating court. Immaculata and Sebastian had been in that Murcia apartment for 16 days, without knowing that each of those days the file that was going to be presented against them was growing in precision and solidity. Confident, calm, convinced that the man they had left behind in Zaragoza had neither the resources nor the determination necessary to track them. That was what they had miscalculated from the beginning. They had underestimated that I've spent more than 2 decades solving problems that others consider unsolvable, and that an engineer doesn't leave a structure half-finished. He always completes it. The report from Augusto Valcárcel arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after we gave him the documents. Lorena notified me by phone with a brief sentence. "It's what we needed. We'll review it together tomorrow." I hung up. I put the secondary phone in my pocket and continued in front of the work computer for another 40 minutes until the last colleague left the floor. Then I turned off the screen, picked up my briefcase, and went down to the building's underground parking. I sat in the car, didn't start the engine. I remained in that particular silence that empty parking lots have at that hour. The distant hum of the ventilation, the occasional click of a metal pipe contracting with the cold, the fluorescent light flickering once every few seconds at the far end of the floor. And then, without it coming from any specific identifiable place, I began to cry. It wasn't an orderly cry. It wasn't the kind of emotion one can manage with a couple of deep breaths and a decisive gesture. It was the accumulation of 27 years suddenly compressing in the chest of a man who had been functioning with the precision of a mechanism for weeks, because he couldn't afford anything less than that. The body, when it endures sustained tension for too long, finds its own moments to release what the will has not authorized. I cried for the house on Predicador Street, which was no longer mine, for the 20 years of mortgage we had paid together and which somehow no longer meant what I thought they meant. For Adrian's birthday, which I arrived late to when he was 11, and which for some absurd and inopportune reason occupied a prominent place in everything that was overwhelming me in that parking lot, for the shared silences on the sofa in 2009, which now had a different texture. Not because they were false then, but because the same person who inhabited them later chose another path. There's a difference between losing something that never existed and losing something that truly existed and ceased to exist. The second one hurts in a way for which there's no useful technical nomenclature. I don't know how long I was like that. I didn't look at the clock. When it passed, I leaned back against the seat, closed my eyes, and let the silence of the parking lot do its work. I thought about Adrian, not with anger, which had already passed, not even with active disappointment, which was also beginning to lose its intensity, but with that specific and irremediable sadness that settles in when you understand that the son you knew and the son you discover exists are the same person, and that reconciling those two versions requires an adjustment that no one can make for you and that isn't completed in a single night in an empty parking lot. I was about to call him. The main phone was in the right pocket of my coat, and for a real, measurable moment, I had the concrete impulse to dial it. Not to retract anything I'd said in his apartment, but out of that need that fathers have, even when they're most hurt, to know that their son is still there on the other side. I didn't call him. I put the phone away without unlocking it and stared at my hands on the steering wheel. I asked myself that night with the honesty that's only possible when no one is watching, if the whole process I'd set in motion was worth the cost it was having, not the economic cost, which was evident and measurable. The other one, the one that doesn't appear on any bank statement. The weeks living in a hotel room, the prepaid phone in my pocket, the meals alone in bars I didn't know, the conversation with Adrian that had ended with a door closing in silence. Immaculata's voice on the phone asking if I had returned well from my trip with the same cadence as always, as if nothing she had done existed outside of her. Was all of that worth continuing? I asked myself the question and let myself have it in my head without trying to solve it quickly, because the questions that are solved quickly in the darkest moments are generally solved poorly. What I found at the bottom of that question, after letting it sit for the necessary time, was not heroic conviction, not renewed anger. It was something simpler and more solid. The certainty that abandoning the process at that point would not return anything I had lost, that the diverted money would not return on its own, that the house would not become mine again simply because I decided not to continue, and that the only difference between continuing and giving up was that one option left everything exactly as it was, and the other, at least, had the possibility of ending differently. It's not a particularly exciting reasoning, but foundations aren't exciting. They're what holds everything else up. I started the car and returned to the hotel. The next morning, I showed up at Lorena's office at 9:10. My face was rested, my briefcase was in order, and the file's schedule had been mentally reviewed during breakfast. The report from Augusto Valcarcel was 42 pages. Dense, technical, structured with the meticulousness expected of someone who has spent 22 years appearing in judicial proceedings, where every word can be questioned. The conclusions were on page 39. The signature that appeared on the notarial power of attorney presented before Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros did not correspond to Salvador Ibanez Carmona. The comparative analysis of 17 specific graphological traits showed systematic and irreconcilable divergences with the authentic specimens provided. There was no room for reasonable doubt. The signature was an elaborate imitation, technically better than the average of the documentary forgeries Augusto had examined throughout his career, but identifiable with certainty through microscopic analysis of a stroke and the differential pressure at the inflection points. I read it twice. Then I left it on the table with the same calm with which I deposit the last signed blueprint of a project that has just passed its final technical review. With this, I said, we now have the basis for the forgery of a public document. With this, Lorena corrected me gently, we have much more than that. We have forgery of a public document, aggravated fraud due to the amount and necessary participation of a public official in a criminal scheme. The penalties corresponding to that set of circumstances, as documented, are not minor. She paused. There's something else I want you to consider before we file the complaint. Lorena explained that the timing of the filing mattered as much as the content. If we filed before Gerardo completed the asset tracking of Sebastián in Murcia, we ran the risk of him moving the remaining assets before the court could order a precautionary freeze. We needed the complaint and the request for precautionary measures to reach the court simultaneously, with documentation solid enough for the judge to act without delay. How many more days? I asked. 5, 7 at most. I nodded. 5 more days. In construction terms, 5 days is the margin reserved before delivery to review the finishes. It's the time when a project stops being a set of well-assembled materials and becomes something finished. I left the office with Augusto's report in the folder and the certainty that what we had been building since late February was about to enter its final phase. Immaculata and Sebastián were still in Murcia. Gerardo was watching them. Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros opened his notary office every morning without knowing that his name already appeared in a file that was going to drag down his career. And I returned to the hotel every night, organized the documents, reviewed the schedule, and kept going. Not because it was easy, but because the structures that matter are never finished on the easy days. The complaint was filed on a Tuesday in March at 10 in the morning at the investigating court of Zaragoza. Lorena had prepared the file during the additional 5 days we had agreed upon. 117 pages organized into 4 blocks, property and asset documentation, Augusto Valcarcel's forensic handwriting expert analysis, Gerardo Villanueva's private investigation and surveillance report, and the history of the closed proceeding in Valencia that linked Sebastián Mora to a previous scheme of equivalent characteristics. Each block with its index, each document with its cross-reference, each figure verified against at least 2 independent sources. When I saw it complete on Lorena's desk the afternoon before she bound it for presentation, I thought it looked a lot like a well-executed construction project, not because the contents had anything in common, but because of the solidity something has when every element is in its exact place and not a single piece is missing or superfluous. Is there a weak point? I asked her. Lorena considered the question honestly before answering. The direct link between Fuentes Ballesteros and Sebastián Mora is documented by a pattern of behavior, not by intercepted explicit communication. A skilled defender might try to present it as a statistical coincidence. She paused briefly, but the pattern is 3 operations in 4 years with the same intermediary and documentary anomalies in 2 of them. Judges know the difference between a coincidence and a method. That was enough for me. On Tuesday morning, while Lorena was filing the file at the courthouse, Gerardo Villanueva was in Murcia. His function that day was specific: to confirm that Sebastián Mora was in the apartment in La Flata during the hours when the complaint was entering the judicial system, so that there would be no room to claim he was not locatable if the court decided to act quickly. It was a technical precaution of the type that engineers would call verification redundancy. Lorena called me at 11:15. Admitted, the judge has reviewed the request for precautionary measures and has ordered the preventive blocking of all identified assets in the names of Sebastián Mora Trigueros and Immaculata Rios Valverde with immediate effect. He has also ordered the summons of Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros to testify as a person under investigation. I was in my office at work when I received that call. The window in front of me looked out onto the street, and for a moment I stared at the cars passing below without seeing any of them in particular. Then I replied that I understood, that I appreciated the communication, and hung up. The colleague at the next desk looked up from his screen and asked if everything was all right. I told him yes. It was a matter with a project that was finally moving forward. It wasn't inaccurate. The following weeks had the particular texture of judicial processes when they are well instructed, slow in appearance, but with a machinery that doesn't stop. Immaculata was summoned to testify on March 17th. She appeared with a public defender, a young man who did what he could with what he had, which wasn't much. Lorena described the testimony to me with her usual economy of words. She denied knowing the details of the power of attorney. She attributed the sale operation to a joint decision that she considered authorized. She paused. The file didn't leave her much room to sustain that version. Sebastián Mora was arrested in Murcia on March 22nd by agents of the National Police in compliance with an order from the investigating court. Gerardo informed me with a 3-word message. This morning confirmed. I read it in the work parking lot, standing next to my car, with the early morning cold on my face. I didn't feel immediate satisfaction. I felt something more like the quiet recognition that a phase of the project had concluded according to the plan. The trial was held at the end of October of that same year, 2024, in the Provincial Court of Zaragoza. Lorena had worked the intervening months with a meticulousness that I, being someone who values professional precision above almost any other quality, observed with genuine respect. The courtroom was smaller than one imagines when thinking of trial. High ceiling, cold light, the sound of pages turning with an almost mechanical regularity. I sat in my assigned place with my back straight and my hands on the table, as I've learned to sit in over 20 years of meetings where what is decided matters. Immaculata was on the other side of the room. We didn't look at each other during the first few hours. Sebastián Mora was to her left in a dark suit and with the expression of someone who has miscalculated how much a structure will withstand under load. Lorena presented the case in the exact order in which we had built it. First, the registration basis, the property in the name of both spouses, the sale executed without the physical presence of the co-owner, the power of attorney as the sole enabling instrument of the operation. Then Augusto Valcarcel's report with its 42 pages and its 17 divergent graphological traits, and its conclusion without possible ambiguity. Then the bank statements with the 137 progressive withdrawals over 18 months. Then Gerardo's report with Sebastián's prior appraisal conducted 9 months before the sale. And finally, the Valencia file, which the court admitted as evidence of preceding conduct under the argument of a systematic criminal pattern. Sebastian's defense attempted 3 different lines of argument. The first was that the power of attorney was valid and that the graphological irregularities were due to natural variations in the complainant's signature. Augusto appeared in person and took 17 minutes to demonstrate, with visual materials and real-time analysis, that this claim was technically indefensible. The second was that the Valencia precedent was irrelevant as it had been closed. The court dismissed it with a brevity that was in itself eloquent. The third was that the amount of the withdrawals from the savings account corresponded to household expenses that Immaculata managed autonomously within the marriage. Lorena responded by presenting the statements from the 5 years prior to the start of the withdrawals, which showed a stable and consistent pattern of domestic spending, absolutely incompatible with the scale and regularity of the extractions during the investigated period. Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros testified as a person under investigation. He maintained that he had followed the identity verification protocol established by current notarial regulations. Lorena presented the other 2 irregular operations identified in his history and requested the court to consider whether the repetition of documentary anomalies in files linked to the same intermediary was compatible with a diligent exercise of the notarial function. The court took note. The last third of the session was for the closing arguments. Lorena spoke for 11 minutes. She didn't raise her voice at any point. When she finished, the courtroom was silent for several seconds before the president of the court announced the suspension until the reading of the verdict. I went out into the hallway with Lorena. She collected her documents with the same calm with which she had laid them out hours before. I leaned against the wall opposite the window that looked out onto the inner courtyard of the judicial building and looked outside for a moment. For years earlier, on a construction site in Huesca, I had to stop the foundation work because the soil analysis revealed an inconsistency that the preliminary report hadn't detected. Some on the team wanted to continue and assumed the risk. I refused. We delayed for 2 weeks, corrected the base, and the building has been standing for 4 years without a single structural problem. Patience isn't an action. It's the invisible work that makes it possible for what's built later to last. Lorena approached and simply said, "It went well." It wasn't a prediction. It was a technical evaluation from someone who had spent months measuring every centimeter of the file and knew exactly how much it could withstand. She was right, and the verdict, when it came, would confirm it with the precision that everything we had built deserved since that February Saturday, when a 68-year-old neighbor came out to the landing with his hands in his pockets and lowered his voice before speaking. The verdict was read on a Thursday in November, 41 days after the trial. Lorena called me at 8:40 in the morning. She had just received the notification. She read me the heading of the ruling with her usual neutral voice. That voice that neither rises nor falls in register regardless of what she has to communicate, and that over time I learned to read not in the tone, but in the speed. When the news is good, she speaks a little slower, like someone savoring each word before delivering it. That morning she spoke slowly. Immaculata Rios Valverde was found guilty of aggravated fraud and forgery of a private document as a necessary cooperator. The sentence established the obligation for full restitution of the financial damages caused, set at €423, 400, and a penalty of 2 years and 8 months of imprisonment, substituted by probation with an electronic monitoring device during the compliance period. A prohibition on leaving the national territory, and mandatory monthly reporting to the Penitentiary Surveillance Court. Sebastián Mora Trigueros was found guilty of aggravated fraud, forgery of a public document as the perpetrator, and belonging to a repeated criminal scheme in consideration of the documented precedent in Valencia. The sentence imposed was 4 years and 6 months of effective imprisonment, with admission to a penitentiary center within a period not exceeding 15 days from the finality of the sentence. The court also ordered the precautionary seizure of all his identified assets until the complete settlement of the damages caused to both victims, including Rosario Pinobaral Contra, the woman from Valencia, who 2 years earlier had not been able to get anyone to rule in her favor. Inocencio Fuentes Ballesteros was provisionally suspended from the exercise of the notarial function, while a separate disciplinary proceeding was initiated before the notarial college. With the transfer of proceedings to the public prosecutor's office to assess criminal liability for his participation in the scheme. I listened to all of that standing in the hotel kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hand that I had stopped bringing to my lips without realizing it. When Lorena finished, I was silent for a moment. "The house," I said. "The reversion process is already underway. The purchasing couple acted in good faith. That's proven in the file, so the compensation they are entitled to will be covered by Sebastian Mora's seized assets. The property returns to the registry in your name in an estimated period of 3 to 5 months, depending on the court's workload. 3 to 5 months. In construction terms, that's the time frame for a finishing phase. It's not immediate, but it's predictable. And what's predictable, when you've been living in uncertainty for months, has a value that isn't measured in time, but in what it gives back to your body." "Thank you," I said to Lorena. She replied that it was her job. Then she added with an inflection I hadn't heard before. "But it was a well-constructed file. That also comes from your side." I hung up. I finished my coffee standing by the window, looking at the street below, where people passed with the rhythm of a November Thursday, knowing nothing of what had just been resolved 4 floors above. There was no celebration. It wasn't the kind of result you celebrate. It was the kind of result you receive with the same seriousness with which you sign the reception certificate of a construction project, with technical satisfaction, with the recognition that the work was well done, and with the clear awareness that the building left standing cost more than any initial budget had contemplated. What came next was the slow part, the months when judicial processes turn into paperwork, into notifications, into deadlines that are met or delayed for bureaucratic reasons that no one fully controls. Lorena managed each stage with the same meticulousness with which she had managed the previous ones. I returned to work as normal. I slept better than I had in months and started looking for an apartment. I didn't want to go back to Predicador Street. It wasn't bitterness. It was simply the understanding that certain spaces become associated with chapters one has already closed, and that forcing oneself to inhabit them again isn't loyalty to anything, but unnecessary resistance to the passage of time. I found an apartment in the Actor neighborhood. 78 square meters, 3rd floor, south-facing, with a small terrace overlooking a quiet inner courtyard. I rented it in December while waiting for the reversion process of the original property to conclude. It was the first space in 27 years that was exclusively mine. I put the furniture where I wanted. I chose the side of the bed to sleep on without that choice, depending on any other factor. I bought a coffee maker that took up more than a reasonable amount of space on the small kitchen counter because I liked it and because there was no one to ask for permission to put it there. Those small things that might seem insignificant to any outside observer have a specific weight that only someone who has been through what I went through can understand. Freedom doesn't always arrive with music. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a coffee maker in the wrong place on a countertop. There was no contact with Adrian during the months following the verdict. Not out of sustained resentment, but because the distance that had opened between us needed time for each of us to fully understand what it meant and what place it would occupy going forward. I didn't close any doors definitively. I simply stopped keeping it wide open, as I had always had it, without conditions and without examination. I learned from a relative that Adrian had taken over the rent of the apartment in Zaragoza without major incidents, that he had managed to increase his hours at work, and that he was, to the extent that could be known from a distance, managing. It wasn't what I would have wanted for him, but it also wasn't the disaster that perhaps a part of me had feared in the worst moments. Children learn in ways that parents don't always control or choose. Sometimes they learn because they're taught with words. Sometimes they learn because something is taken away from them, and they discover they can stand on their own without it. I don't know which of those ways leaves a more lasting mark. What I do know is that the second option was the only honest one in those circumstances, and that honesty, even if it's hard, is the only thing that doesn't devalue over time. I heard nothing directly from Immaculata. I didn't seek it. The legal process kept us at a sufficient distance that no personal contact was necessary. And when the judicial machinery finished its work, there was no reason to create one either. There are people with whom you share decades, and in the end, you discover that the language left between you was that of papers and deadlines. When those two are exhausted, only silence remains. And silence, in this case, was exactly what was appropriate. The sentence became final in January of the following year, 2025. After the appeals filed by Sebastián Mora's defense were dismissed in the second instance, he entered the Singanra La Verde Penitentiary Center in Murcia 20 days later. Rosario Penalver, the woman from Valencia, finally received the compensation that she hadn't been able to collect 2 years earlier. Lorena informed me in a brief message that for some reason I couldn't fully explain to myself was the news that relieved me the most of all that arrived in those months. Perhaps because Rosario hadn't had anyone to build the case for her the first time, and this time, without knowing it, she had. The deed for the property on Predicador Street returned to my name in March 2025. Lorena sent me the registered copy by mail. I printed it, looked at it for a moment, and filed it in the same folder where the original 1998 deed was. Then I put the coffee maker on and waited for the water to boil. I didn't go back to that apartment. I put it up for sale that same month through an agency with which I had no prior relationship, with all the documentation in order and without any kind of power of attorney. It sold in 6 weeks. It's been 14 months since that February afternoon when I rang the doorbell of my own house and an unknown family peeked out the window. I'm telling this now from the apartment, an actor with the morning light coming in through the south-facing terrace and the coffee maker making its usual noise in the kitchen. It's a Saturday with no commitments. I have the blueprints for a new project spread out on the table and a cup that I've filled twice without finishing either. Sometimes you sit down to work and what you end up doing is something else. What you end up doing is ordering everything that happened, giving it the shape it deserves, and asking yourself, what does it mean now that the dust has settled and there are no open fronts that demand immediate attention? I'm not going to say that I'm well in the same way I was well before. That man no longer exists, and it would be dishonest to pretend he does. The man who lived on Predicador Street with the quiet certainty that what he had built was solid because he had built it. That man received information that changed him in a way that no judicial process, however well resolved, has the capacity to fully reverse. What I can say is that the man who exists now knows things that the other one didn't know, and that some of those things, although they came wrapped in considerable damage, have a value that I wouldn't have obtained in any other way. I learned that trust without review isn't a virtue, it's a habit. And habits, when they become comfortable enough, turn into blind spots. I had mine for years, and I held on to them with the same energy I hold on to any conviction I don't want to examine, because examining it would cost something. That doesn't make me responsible for what happened, but it does make me co-responsible for not having seen it coming when the signs were there, distributed over time with a visibility I only recognized when it was too late for that recognition to be of any preventive use. The difference between that learning and guilt is important. Guilt paralyzes. Learning, when you work through it with honesty, does exactly the opposite. There's a question I've been asked by the few people who know what happened, formulated in different ways, but with the same underlying theme. If I went back to that moment, if I could go back to that week in February before the trip, would I do something different? The honest answer is that I don't know, that there probably are some things that I would have reviewed the accounts more frequently, that I would have paid more attention to closed doors and repeated answers, that I would have made the space between us a topic of conversation before letting that space fill up on its own with whatever each of us decided to put there without saying it. But I also know that there's a limit to what a man can do when the person in front of him has decided that transparency no longer interests them. You can build whatever you want with all the dedication in the world, and there's a variable that no engineering calculation contemplates. The will of others. That's not on any blueprint. There's no safety factor that covers it. What I could control was what I did afterward. And what I did afterward was the only thing that could be done. Document, build, wait for the right moment. Not act out of rage, but out of precision. Not because I'm a person without emotions. That empty parking lot on a Thursday night can attest to the contrary. but because decades of experience teach that decisions made from unprocessed pain generally produce results that need to be corrected later. And I already had enough pending corrections without adding more. I think about Adrian with a frequency that has changed in nature over time. At first, it was a painful frequency with that specific edge of family disappointment that's unlike any other. Now it's something more like the serene concern of a father who has decided that love doesn't imply an absence of consequences. I love him. That hasn't changed. But love without structure is just feeling, and feeling without structure teaches no one anything. If one day Adrian understands what happened in its full dimension, not just the part he saw from his apartment with the blind halfway down, I hope he also understands why I reacted as I did. Not so that he agrees with me. I no longer need anyone to agree with me. But because there are lessons that are only learned when someone who loves you decides that protecting you from the consequences of your own choices isn't a form of love, but a form of deferred harm. That's what I want to remain from all of this. Not the one case, not the 423,000 euros recovered, although its recovery was just and necessary. Not the signed sentence, nor Sebastian Mora's name in a prison registry. What I want to remain is this, that a 52-year-old man with hands tired from decades of work and a head full of cracks that no one saw from the outside decided that what he had built throughout his life deserved to be defended. Not with violence, not with the kind of revenge that leaves a scar on the one who exacts it, but with the only tool that no one had taken from him when they took everything else. The accumulated experience of someone who has spent a long time solving problems that others abandoned for being too complex. That's what they underestimated. Not my assets, not my contacts, not my financial capacity to hire Lorena or Gerardo. They underestimated that a man who has spent 25 years learning to read complex structures and find the exact point where they fail doesn't stop when the structure that's failing is his own. He sits down, analyzes, and starts from the foundation. There's an entire generation of people who learned to do things without shortcuts because there were no shortcuts available, who learned to wait because impatience didn't speed anything up, who learned that the solidity of what is built depends directly on the solidity of what is put underneath, even if that which is put underneath is never seen by anyone. That generation has been treated for years as something that has already passed, something that time left behind without looking. I'm part of that generation, and what happened in the last 14 months of my life is, among other things, the demonstration that what time leaves behind without looking sometimes has much more inside than anyone calculated. This morning, before sitting down with the blueprints and the coffee maker, I went out onto the terrace for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour. The trees on the street below have that specific stillness of late winter when they haven't fully budded yet, but you can already tell that something is preparing itself under the bark. When I came back inside, I did what I always do when crossing a threshold. I put my hand in my coat pocket and took out the key. The same automatic gesture as always, the same hand, the same pocket, the same movement I've repeated so many times that it no longer requires any conscious instruction from the brain. I looked at it for a moment as I have looked at it thousands of times. Then I put it away again. In February of last year, that same gesture left me with a key in my palm that no longer opened any known door. Today, that same gesture, done in the same order, with the same cadence as always, has a different ending. This door responds, and that, after everything it has cost to get here, is exactly enough.